Hello, welcome to Mr. Lee's video on the Progressive Era. Today we're going to talk about social activism and political reform from 1890 and 1920, focusing on issues that were going around in urban areas and cities. The only thing you guys need to write down is what is underlined. If I go too fast and skip to the next slide on the video, go back to the previous slide, and you can pause it and take down the notes that you need. So for the first slide here, we're going to talk about the rapid urbanization that occurred in the late 19th century in the Northeast and the Midwest, the same area that we've been focusing on for the last several classes. We're focusing on big areas of cities such as Chicago, Boston, Baltimore, and particularly New York City. Many of the examples that I'm going to give today are talking about New York City. And a lot of immigrants, as we've said, have been focusing in on these cities because that is where the available jobs and the affordable housing was. Many immigrants that came to this country were of the lower class. They don't have a whole lot of money. Many of them were in severe poverty, and the only money that they had, they used to create jobs for and to get on a boat to come to this country. So a lot of immigrants, like we said before, 1870 came from North and Western Europe. After 1870, you get a lot of immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, and each of these immigrants settled in their own housing groups inside the cities. That's how you get areas in different cities such as Little Italy, Chinatown. You have the Irish quarters, all that kind of stuff kind of set up where each of these immigrants could go and find people who are very similar to them, language, customs, and culture that were similar to them. So even though that during the turn of the century there was a lot of immigration going on, as you can see here, by 1910, immigrants made up more than half of the population of most major American cities. Something else that helped increase the population of cities was something that was going on in rural areas, so particularly in the Midwest and then also especially the South. And this was the rapid improvements in farm technology. This meant that there was a decline in the intensity of labor and also the number of farmers needed. So you could produce more crops and more food with less number of people. And then particularly in the South, the big impact that this had was that it meant a less amount of African Americans need. By 1900, roughly 90% of African Americans were still living in the South. That quickly changed with a lot of these inventions in farming technology. Many of these African Americans no longer had jobs that were available to them from the sharecropping that was left over from the Reconstruction era. As these jobs started to decline, as farmers began to realize that they could get a machine to replace a human labor, and you don't need to pay a machine. All you need to worry about is maintenance, and that's it. You don't need to pay them. You don't need to feed them. You don't need to house them, nothing like that. So they began to lay off more and more workers. This particularly meant more and more African Americans were suddenly finding themselves at jobs. So they moved to northern cities such as Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York in droves and droves and droves. By 1920, there'd be 1.5 million African Americans living in urban areas in northern cities. Now, once these African Americans got to northern cities, even though they were much more likely to be allowed some of the freedoms, such as the right to vote, than in the South, they were still treated just as harshly and just as alienated as immigrants were. They were often put in their own ghettos in the minority areas, and blacks wanted to stick together as well because they wanted to make sure that their customs and culture that had been denied for them so long and because of slavery was still in its very, very infant form and been destroyed so much. They wanted to try to keep what little bit was left together. These huge, massive movements of African Americans as well also led to redeeming an African American culture and a surge of African American culture that led to the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s in New York City. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next unit. This is just a map right here that kind of shows you a demonstration about what the population shift were. If you look at these states down here, if you look at the cursor where all these were negative are, this is percent of population that lost a lot of them. So basically every southern state, especially if you look at Florida, if you look at Georgia, you look at South Carolina, we're losing 6 to 7% of the entire populations in African American movement. If you go up north, you see that states that had significant gains in African American population on this time is where you expect the major cities to be. You're looking at New York City here, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Chicago and Detroit all had huge amounts of increase in African American populations during this time period because of the Great Migration, particularly in the availability of factory jobs. So, or opening up in these northern states as farming jobs were declining in southern states. So we have huge amounts of immigrants moving into these northern cities. You have huge amounts of African American populations moving into these northern cities, and you also had whites from the South or poor whites from the South, sorry, that were also losing farming jobs, moving into the city as well. So just in general, the urban populations during this time period, for the three factors that I just mentioned, are really exploding. And so with this explosion of people, you're also going to get a lot of problems. The first two problems that we're going to talk about are housing and sanitation. This is a huge, huge, huge problem, particularly for immigrants in urban areas or for poor people in general. So we talked about tenements before, and when you guys did your urbanization simulation, you saw how crowded things got sometimes. When they created these cities, they would not necessarily plan anything, just like you guys had problems with, that things would kind of spring up, things would get really crowded, and it caused huge amounts of problems. The tenements are what we're going to particularly talk about. As you said before, a tenement is a house that is kind of like a very small apartment in a city that is usually put out of poor material in a poor area, and there were no real regulations to it during this time period. So tenements often had two or more families per apartment. And in New York City in particular, in terms of sanitation, less than 1% of these tenements in 1890 had access to indoor plumbing. So with no indoor plumbing, that means you have no indoor bathroom. So if you don't have an indoor bathroom, that means if you need to use the bathroom, you're either going out on the street or you have a pot in the corner or a bucket and you go that, and then you have to dump that out on the street. So this would cause not only sanitation problems inside the tenements, but also outside on the streets. Sometimes piles up to 2 feet deep of human and animal waste would end up in the streets or rivers. And with the rivers, obviously, that's going to lead to problems with drinking water, which we'll talk about on the next slide in terms of diseases that. So there's very, very basic necessities that we think of today in terms of indoor plumbing and overcrowded. So they did not have those laws or regulations back then. And with the Progressive Era, this is when that stuff starts to change. So we'll talk about those changes in a second. But one of the biggest things that New York City did to try and clean up the waste in the street was they hired George Waring as a sanitation engineer to try and fix problems of what was going on and how to get rid of the human and animal waste in the streets. So with all of the human and animal waste in the streets, one of the biggest things that it led to was the disease of cholera. So cholera is a intestinal infection that takes place when you do not have access to safe or clean drinking water. So a cholera epidemic in New York City during this time period in the 1890s had a death rate of almost 20% for the tenements, but it barely touched the cleaner districts. And when we say cleaner districts, we really mean where the wealthy were, where they did have access to indoor plumbing. In wealthy houses, they would almost always have indoor plumbing. It was something that had been around for 20, 30 years for the wealthy people, but the poor people could not afford to install it themselves, nor did the people who were in charge of their apartments. They did not care enough about the people in the apartments to pay to have those upgraded. They just wanted to try to get as many people in a small as area as possible. So these cholera epidemics would often come because people did not have access to safe drinking water. Majority of the time, the drinking water came from the rivers or streams that were nearby or puddles or things like that, where it would sit there for a long period of time. And with people either using the bathroom in the streets or going on a bucket or a pot inside the house and then pouring it out on the streets, once it rained, all the waste would often run downhill right into the drinking water, and then people would drink that water. So a lot of stuff was going on that would try and cause all these infections, and cholera was obviously the most epidemic one. In terms of child labor was another huge issue during this time period that progressive reformers tried to fix, and we'll talk a little bit about how they tried to fix those in the next slide. Children were also often exploited because of their size, either in going in between large machines and being able to fix them. They had tiny hands, tiny feet. They could swim in small places. And then also they could fit into small areas of coal mines. Coal mining was a largely percentage child labor job at this time, especially once you got deep down in the mines. They could fit in the tunnels that are only 3 to 4 foot wide. Also, children were popular as labels because they were being young. They could be exploited. They could often argue that they would be paid less as the workers. In the coal mines, They would have lack of clean air for 8 to 10 hours a day. So diseases such as pneumonia and black lung disease were common. Many of these children died at a young age from either workplace accidents or from related lung diseases. Also, they were not treated very well in terms of what they were fed. In a book by John Spargo, who is a muckraker who worked on trying to help out these guys, one boy described child workers being fed less food than the master's pigs that they were doing, that their boss's pigs. So the boys would often steal meatballs out of the pigs' slop trays in order to eat them for themselves. So besides a whole host of cleanliness issues there, it's clear that their bosses cared more about the pigs and trying to fatten them up than they did about the kids. So as the muckrakers, and muckrakers, if I haven't mentioned it before, is basically just a term for the people during this era who would try to fix a lot of these problems in society. They would try to fix things like child labor, clean drinking water. They would try to fix the problems of the tenements and all that stuff. So with the muckrakers working on all this stuff, they would establish the National Child Labor Committee that was established in 1904. Fire was also a big problem that you see here, as you can see from one of the pictures we have here. The rare access to indoor plumbing meant that they had to put out fires from nearby streams or rivers, often just carrying it from bucket to bucket to bucket. So there's no fire hydrants like we have in modern day areas. Also in the tenement areas or the poor areas of cities, you would have poorly built wooden tenements that were close, very close together. So once fire started in one area, it would spread to one another very, very quickly. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pause this because I'm running out of time. They only can speak for a certain amount of time. So go ahead and finish up the notes if you haven't already, and then look for Urban Problems video number 2, which you can do.